Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Scott McKain in Las Vegas, Nevada. Scott is a best-selling author, Hall of Fame professional speaker, and an authority on creating distinction for your business and career. His book, Create Distinction: What to Do When Great Isn't Good Enough to Grow Your Business, was named by 30 major newspapers as one of the 10 best business books of the year. Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Angela, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's so nice to meet you. And just before we started recording, you mentioned that you've actually been to Memphis, to my office. So the building where my office is. So I'm really excited about that too.
It's really neat. I've got a very, very good friend, Don Hudson, who has his office in the same building as yours. And it's such a neat place in terms of, the creativity that you can just feel when you walk in there. There's a buzz, there's an excitement about it, and I love where you work, and I'm envious.
Yeah, it's such a good building. Well,
yeah, it really is.
I'm so excited to have you here today to talk with us both about sort of business topics as well as job-seeking topics. And the area where I really want to start, I saw a video of you speaking about your book, The 7 Tenets of Taxi Terry. And literally, as I was listening, the hair on my arms was standing up because the story was so great. So I was wondering, in a nutshell, could you share with us a little bit about what it was that this Taxi Terry was able to do to make himself unique, even though he was a taxi driver?
Well, I appreciate that because, one of the things that struck me so much about what he does is that, if you think about an area where it's incredibly difficult to differentiate yourself, taxi driving would have to be part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just as job seekers are trying to find ways to stand out in what they're doing so that employers choose them. I mean, how do you stand out as a cab driver? Your cab looks about the same as everyone else's. You're doing about the same as everybody else does. There's not a whole lot of room for variation with cab drivers, but this guy's amazing. I was flying into Jacksonville, Florida to give a speech, and the flight was late, and I dragged myself off the plane. The line for cabs is long, and I'm just standing there thinking about how little sleep I'm going to get before the big meeting the next morning, and my cab driver pulls up, as they all do, but this guy did something completely different. He jumped out of his cab, he pointed at me in the front of the line and shouted, "Are you ready for the best cab ride of your life?" And I got to be honest, Angela, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm with a nut.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with a... And I said, yeah, I guess so. He jogs over, he gets my bag, he turns around and shakes my hand, and he says, "Good evening, Mr. McKain." And I said, "Well, how'd you know my name?" He said, "Saw it on your luggage, figured I might as well use it." And he said, "I'm Taxi Terry." Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of this great cab ride, and it was just absolutely amazing. When I told him I was there to talk about, he asked me why I was in town, and I said, "Well, I'm giving a speech on customer service, customer retention." And he goes, "Customer service, I am so into that."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Do you mind if I record our conversation?" And I'm like, "Why are you so set up to record conversations? I mean, cash cab, or taxi cab confessions,
Right.
And he said, if a local customer, he told me the example of a doctor that uses his services. And, for example, the doctor mentioned that his daughter had just enrolled at Vanderbilt.
Mm-hmm.
So the doctor gets to the airport, Terry hits the button, records that information. And then he said, every night when I get home, I take these recordings that I made, and I enter the information into my database. And I'm thinking, now we got a cab driver on CRM. And he said, then the next time the doctor makes a reservation, naturally the information pops up.
Mm-hmm.
So he's in the cab, and I say, "By the way, doctor, I've been wondering, how is your daughter Jill doing at Vanderbilt?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, it makes it so personal and so amazing that the doctor wouldn't ride with anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So Terry gets me to the hotel, and he jumps out of the cab, and he gets my bag out of the trunk, and he hands my bag to the bellman and says, "Presenting Mr. McKain."
Oh.
I've never had that happen before. And he mentions that, he wants to give great service. But he didn't give me a receipt.
Mm-hmm.
And you know how it is when you're traveling, you need to keep your receipts for your expense purposes. And he said you can print out your receipt and reserve your return trip on my website, taxiterry.com.
Wow.
And it's funny, Angela, because I'll be standing in front of a crowd giving that speech, and when I mention that, I literally see about 5 or 6 people who will whip out their smartphone or they're on their iPad and they'll type in just to see if this is a real guy. Is this a real story?
Yeah.
And taxiterry.com is his website for his cab rides in Jacksonville.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just an amazing experience. And there's several things I took from that ride. Matter of fact, McGraw-Hill, the big publisher in New York City, approached me and said, "Would you write a book about what you learned from that ride?"
Okay.
And I broke it down into 7 steps, and came out with that book called The 7 Tenets of Taxi Terry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was fascinating to me as well to think that Uber is not going to disrupt Taxi Terry.
Mm-hmm.
Uber is disrupting the non-distinctive cab drivers in the respective cities. If there's no reason for me to choose one cab over another, but Uber offers, the convenience that they do with the app, and you don't even pay for it. It's already, it's already billed to your card. You don't have to tip. You don't have to. Why wouldn't I choose Uber? But Taxi Terry gives me a compelling alternative, and because of that, he's still going to get chosen instead of other cab drivers or instead of Uber. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lesson there in terms of folks that are seeking jobs and trying to advance their career. Matter of fact, more than one, there's several. But one is that Taxi Terry isn't different just for difference sake. Mm-hmm. He's different in ways that have meaning and create traction with his customers.
Right.
And I think a lot of times job seekers trying to stand out over the plethora of other applicants many times try to be different just to grab attention, not understanding that what employers are looking for is really a level higher than that. That's the level I call distinction, where what you do or the difference that you make adds value to what they're seeking and really creates a connection with them that helps both your career and their organization. And that's what Taxi Terry does. It's not different just to be different. It's different because it's more significant and compelling and meaningful for his customers. And so guess what his customers do? They reward him with more business.
Right.
They reward him with referrals. They reward him with more money. And so it creates this cycle that helps Terry to continue to maintain and grow his business.
No, absolutely. It's funny. After I saw your speech about it, the first thing I went to was his website as well.
No kidding. Yeah.
I wanted to check. And it's funny that you bring up Uber. Just last night, I was at a blues event here in Memphis, and a girlfriend met me there, and she came in and she said, "I took Uber, and it was amazing. The driver was so great, and at the end of the ride, he gave me a Snickers bar." And I was like, what? I thought, it was, she pulled it out. She showed it to everyone through the whole night and talked about how great Uber was. And I thought, I don't know that those Uber drivers are making enough money to give a Snicker bar to everyone. But she certainly will ride with that person again if given the opportunity.
It's so true. Well, if you think about what Uber did, it's almost kind of like how Apple developed the iPhone, or how Enterprise Rental Car changed the rental car business. It started out with thinking about all the things you absolutely hated about doing business in that industry. So, if you think about what's the problem with a cab, well, you've got to find them if you're in a city, right? If I'm in Memphis and I walk out, I might call them and schedule them in advance, which is kind of a pain. Or I stand on the street with my hand up, hoping one comes by and I can flag them down. And with Uber, I just pull out my phone, and it'll even tell me how long the wait is, and shows me a picture of the driver, and the car's nice and clean, and the driver's friendly, and it automatically goes on my credit card, and the tip's included, and it simplifies everything about that. And I think that's part of what we need to be thinking about, is that Uber was able to solve the problems of the customer. And really, when we're looking for employment or we're seeking to advance our career, a lot of times what I've seen in my small business and from my friends throughout the years is that they focus on their career or themselves and their needs, and not the needs of the organization and not the benefit of the company. And when you make that shift, you become significantly more attractive. When you make the shift to focusing on them and not you, then all of a sudden, better things happen for you. And it's like, Taxi Terry, when I get in the cab, he says, how long are you going to be in Jacksonville? And I said, well, just a couple days. He said, well, let's check out the weather. And he touches the dash, and he's got an iPhone on a bracket with a magnifying glass set to the weather channel. And so now, did I get off the plane expecting meteorological information from my method of transportation? No, you don't expect your cab driver is going to give you the weather. But and one of the things Terry told me later, he said, well, think about who a lot of the people are coming into Jacksonville. They're golfers. Right? The headquarters of the PGA is just a few miles south. There's a lot of great golf courses in the area. So the success of your vacation is dependent to some degree upon the weather.
Okay.
And so he was delivering information that was of significant value to a high percentage of his customers. And so that's part of the shift I think we have to make, is when we look at how we're communicating with employers, and when we look at what we're saying in our applications and in our work, how are we positioning it so that it's of value to them and not just a litany of information about ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. That totally makes sense. Well, you mentioned creating distinction a number of times, and you have a book called Create Distinction, and you have a chapter that really stuck out to me called Who Moved My Career? And yeah, I like it. But you talk specifically about an example where you're having a conversation with someone who described, in their opinion, why it was easier to lay off certain types of employees over others. And you'll have to tell me, but from reading it, you sounded surprised.
What was surprising was how, I guess I'm coming from the perspective that when you're talking about laying off people, you're talking about people's lives and their careers and the impact that it has on families. And it was just kind of the dispassionate, almost cold way that it was being expressed. But that layoffs really, to this individual, wasn't really that big a deal, because there was no meaningful difference between the person doing the job in Baltimore and the person doing the job in Bangalore. And that it was easier to get rid of non-distinctive professionals who all did the same thing, and to outsource that or to replace that or to automate that, because there was just no meaningful value that those employees were bringing to the organization.
Absolutely.
And it was. I don't know. I guess, growing up as I did in the family in the way that I did, in a very working class family, thinking about what an individual layoff meant to that family, I was coming more from that perspective. But the coldness and the callousness with which this person was expressing this to me was really impactful, because it really made me see that the only way that a person, a employee in that group of people he was talking about, the only way that they were going to keep their job was to stand out. Because there's this really interesting article that Thomas Friedman did, and it was he included it in part of his book, The World is Flat. And he was talking about being in India, and as he's going through this office in India, he noticed they were all working on U.S. tax returns, the Form 1040. And as they discussed it, it was accountants just sending that information, CPAs just sending that information to India because the numbers were going to be the same whether you did the return in India or whether you did the return in Illinois. And so the tax preparer, the person who would typically do that in Illinois had been replaced by cheaper labor from India simply because all they were good at doing was filling out the form. So then he said, so who are the people that are still working with clients in Illinois? And he said, it's the people who stand out. It's the people who are able to, do something of value to their clients above and beyond filling out the return. And so when it made me think that, previously I'd thought of my accountant as the person who did my taxes. Really now it's the person who stands out because he talks to me about, ways to save on my taxes. And he talks to me about ideas, above and beyond just filling out the form. And there's a great new book by Jeff Colvin. It's Geoff, Colvin, Jeff Colvin. It's called Humans Are Underrated. And it's a fascinating look at the fact that everything that can be automated is going to be automated. So in other words, the ability to fill out our tax return or whatever, anything that we can do by computer eventually is going to be done by computer. Even driving a car eventually. I mean, we see with what Google is doing. The rumors are Apple jumping into that. I mean, so if you're a truck driver, you wouldn't think that would be a job that could be replaced by automation. But at some point, it might. But he said, here's what we can't do is the connect with others. That's what can't be automated. Being able to stand out and to connect with others and to provide additional value, that's what prevents you from being replaced. And so interestingly enough, part of what he was saying is, therefore, the more you have empathy with other people and the more that you express that empathy, it is going to be one of the most valued aspects in the job market in the future. It's really a fascinating book, and it made me think about my own philosophy about distinction. And it's the same kind of thing. You can't create distinction without connection. Right? I mean, how can I be distinctive if I'm not connecting with my employer and with my customers and with my coworkers? And so that's so critically important. I know, Angela, you got your MBA at Pepperdine, and that's one of my favorite spots in the world. And,
it's very pretty, yeah.
Oh, how did you ever leave? I'm like, every time I'm at Pepperdine, and I go back every year, and I give a speech for free at Pepperdine every year to what's called the Youth Citizenship Seminar. And it's held every summer. And the reason I do it is because the former chancellor of Pepperdine, Dr. Charles Runnels, who just turned 90 and still goes to campus every day, and he made this amazing connection. And I bring that up because of your connection with Pepperdine, but also because if you look at the list of speakers for this thing, I always joke, it's like you read the list and you get to my name and think, what's wrong with this picture? Or one of these things is not like the other. Because Tommy Lasorda, former manager of the Dodgers, John Voight, I'm drawing a blank on his name. The guy that's the host of The Bachelor, Chris.
Oh, yeah.
You know who I'm talking about. It's just unbelievable, the celebrities and the political leaders. Dennis Prager, that's a talk show host out there. There's just an incredible lineup of people who all donate their time. George Foreman speaks every year at this for free. The boxing champion, the George Foreman Grill, he comes every year for free to speak at this. And it's all because of the connection that we have with Dr. Reynolds.
Okay.
That's it. And so it is a yearly reminder. That's also part of why I do it every year to go to Pepperdine, is a yearly reminder that in business, the greatest thing that we can do is make connections.
Oh, yes.
It makes us stand out. It creates distinction when we can make distinctive connections. And it's just one of the most critical things that your listeners can do.
Yes. It's interesting that you bring up Pepperdine. I went to college in the Northeast in New York at a well-known engineering school, and It was very cold. There was a lot of snow. So the experience at Pepperdine was very different. And, Pepperdine is in Malibu. It overlooks the ocean. And I went there, as you said, for business school. That's where I did my MBA. And as you would kind of drive up the hill, the business school is at the very top of the campus. And, you might be nervous because there's an exam or something. And you kind of finally get to the top of the hill and you look out and you see the ocean. It's beautiful. And then you walk up the stairs to go to class, and they have this waterfall coming down, sort of the middle or near the stairs that you see. And then they have sort of this music playing, and it's very calming. And then you get into the classroom, and I found at Pepperdine the professors were so encouraging and so nurturing. And it's interesting because looking back, when I compare my graduate degree with my undergraduate degree, I have maintained those business connections that you mentioned with my professors from Pepperdine, but not necessarily with my college. And I think it had so much to do with that distinctive experience, and it was just so positive that you want to continue to be involved with it.
Yeah, that makes such a great point, too, because I think a lot of people at the beginning could see that campus and think, well, of course you're going to have a great time. Look at the surroundings. And there's no doubt that's extraordinary. But the other thing I've noticed about Pepperdine is the same thing I've noticed about other distinctive businesses of all types, and that is it's the people. If the professors would have been cold, it doesn't matter how warm the temperature was. It's that combination of the magic's in the mix, and it's that combination of the encouragement and the warmth and all of those things that you're talking about. That it's you blend that together and mix that together, and you've got an extraordinary institution like Pepperdine, or an extraordinary business. I mean, that's the kind of business I want to run.
Right.
Where people are encouraging and warm and all that. And so I think it provides a great lesson for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so kind of on the flip side, in your book, Create Distinction, you also talk about sort of the destroyers of differentiation, and specifically 3. What are those 3 destroyers, and why are they important to us as an individual employee?
Well, the first one is perhaps one of the more important ones for employees, and that's copycat competition. What tends to happen is if I see someone is successful, then my immediate response is, well, I'll do what they're doing, and that'll work for me too. Now, in employment, it seems to me that it's the difference between imitation and modeling. I want someone to model the best behavior of top producers and performers. I don't want them necessarily to become clones or carbon copies. And so I think what we have to do is to take a look at, what's being successful in the marketplace and what's out there. But if all we're doing is attempting to imitate that, then we're falling right back into that commodity trap that we were talking about earlier with the employer laying off people. If eventually all we're going to be is the same as everybody else. And so the thing I'd encourage is to again, I get back to that definition of being the difference between modeling what's successful as opposed to being a pale imitation of what's successful. And so, if, for example, how do I find ways to stand out while continuing to do what's being successful in the industry that I'm seeking employment or advancement? The second of the 3 is tougher competition. For a business, that frequently means that because of the internet, the number of alternatives for customers has grown exponentially. I think to a degree that's true in the employment market as well. But the other thing that I see happening is, good grief, the applicants, the pool of qualified people is really difficult and tough. I mean, obviously it depends on the industry. I was just reading about shortage in nurses, but it just seems like I hear about how difficult it is just to get admitted to a college today. What wasn't true when I was applying. Thank God. but how much more everything seems to be more difficult today, and therefore that makes it tougher to stand out, but makes it more important to be able to do so. The third one is that familiarity breeds complacency, and I think that happens many times after we get into our job. Is the job becomes very familiar, and we become more competent at doing it, and therefore we take our employment for granted. Right? I mean, we just kind of take it for granted. And as we've seen so many times, that is not the case. We can't take anything for granted today anymore. And so how do we resolve that? Well, we nurture what's important to us. We find ways to nurture those things that are critical. So what are the ways that we can nurture our employment, our everything else to make it more compelling for us to be on your team? I mean, I want to work with engaged people. Steve Jobs is overused as an example, but I'm sure most of your listeners know that Steve Jobs' philosophy was we only have A employees at Apple. Not just because we seek to employ that kind of people, but the A employees, if you surround them with B people, they become B employees or they go someplace else. The top people like working with top people because it challenges them. It makes the job more rewarding and enriching. And so that's part of what we have to do is to not get complacent and to discipline and force ourselves to become, more exciting and A-list kind of folks.
I totally agree. Occasionally I will speak with a job seeker who will say, I just want to find something where I can have a lot more work-life balance. I want to be there from 8 to 4, and I don't want to have to really engage myself too much, but I do want them to pay me what I've been making over the past 20 years, this very high salary. And do you think we could find something like that? And I always think, wow, it's a really tall order to fill because the market is so competitive that you can't expect that you will be complacent and then you will be rewarded for that. There are just too many people who are willing to step up and, like you said, be different or, be more helpful or put a little something extra into it, actually care about their work.
No, the late Earl Nightingale used to call that the wood stove syndrome. And here's how he explained it. And picture yourself sitting in front of a fireplace or a wood stove. You would never think to say to the fireplace, okay, give me some heat first and then I'll put in the wood.
Right.
Right? But isn't that kind of how we approach employment sometimes? Oh, I'd work harder if you gave me a raise. Well, as the owner of a small business, my response would be, I'll tell you what, prove to me first that you can work harder, then I'll give you the raise. And by the way, if you had the capacity to work harder to begin with, why are you holding that back?
Right.
But, and again, it's the wood stove syndrome. If you have the capacity to work harder and to do more, then do it, and you'll be rewarded for it. But don't hold it back, for goodness sakes.
Well, in a lot of your materials, you also talk about the 4 cornerstones of distinction, so making yourself more distinct. Can you talk a little bit about what those 4 cornerstones are?
You bet. The first of the 4 cornerstones is clarity. And by the way, one of the things that I observed in the research was that while all 4 are important, they also tended to be executed in this particular order. Now, not a requirement, but most distinctive professionals and distinctive organizations followed this particular order. So the first one is clarity. You got to be crystal clear about who and what you are in the marketplace. The distinctive organizations really have their flag in the ground of what they are and what they represent. I mean, we're never going to confuse Apple with Acer.
That's right.
There's no doubt. I'm not confusing those two. I'm not confusing Southwest Airlines with U.S. Airways.
Right.
You know them. They are distinctive in their approaches. And what I often find with people is that we want to be, as the old cliche says, a mile wide and an inch deep. What what would you like to do in your career? I don't know. What would you like me to do? What's open? I'll take anything, right? And there is a real attraction to people who are absolutely clear about who they are and what they're doing and what's important. You can't differentiate what you can't define. So if I can't define to a prospective employer why they should choose me instead of other applicants, then why shouldn't they choose someone else? Right? I mean, and that's really, really hard for a lot of folks to accept. It was hard for me to wrap my head around, frankly, in the beginning. But it's that if we think about how a customer chooses where they're going to do business, or how an employer chooses which of the applicants will get a promotion or will get the job, it's not that they're choosing you. They're choosing you instead of the other alternatives.
That's true.
Right? And so I tend to think oh, pick me. Well, it's not that. It's I've got to show you why you should pick me instead of these other alternatives. So if I'm not clear about what my advantages are, if I'm not clear about what I can bring to the table, then what I've done is to erode any distinction that I have because I haven't been clear in why they should select me as opposed to other alternatives. So being very clear and very precise, not only about what you want, but perhaps even more importantly about what advantages you bring to a customer or prospective employer. And I'm certain you have other folks touch on this, and you do as well, Angela. But if we start looking at prospective employers, or HR directors choosing for promotion, if we start looking at them as customers,
yes,
I think that change in viewpoint helps get us to where we need to be. Right? If you're the customer, I'm not thinking about what I can get from you. I'm thinking about how can I serve you so that you will repeat the business, and so you'll refer me to your friends, and you'll do, the things that will grow my business. And so that approach, thinking about, okay, if they were a customer, what can I do that would be so compelling that they would choose me instead of these other alternatives? So that's clarity is step number one. Step two is creativity. Now, the reason I said these tend to go in this order is because one of the things that surprised me as I was studying this is that I guess the bias that I started with was that creativity would be first, right? How do you become distinctive? You get creative. But that's not the case. You begin with clarity, and then once you've established that, then within the boundaries of that clarity, then you get creative. I interviewed some songwriters in Nashville.
Oh,
because I wanted to talk to people who their very career depended on, getting up every morning and being creative, right? I mean, because I think most of us think, well, the muse will strike me, or I'm waiting on inspiration. These are people who can't wait on inspiration, or they don't eat. I mean, they have to continue this output of songs,
right?
And I was speaking one time to the woman who wrote the song "Breathe" for Faith Hill. Okay, and she was telling me how there's so many decisions that you have to make before you start composing. Is this going to be a rock song or a pop song or a country song? Is it going to be a ballad, or is it going to be an up-tempo? Is it going to be sung by a male or a female or a group? How do you perceive this song? So once you get clear on that, then you get creative. And this is a woman who's written, number one songs on the rock charts, the pop charts, the country charts, and adult contemporary charts, so extraordinarily successful. So it really inspired me to think about, it begins with the clarity, but then within those boundaries, we get creative. Now, the important thing here is that differentiation, just for difference sake, doesn't create distinction.
Right.
Right? If I slapped every HR director in the face when I interview, I would be really different, right? But I'd never be hired.
Right.
They remember me. You're different, but I'd never be hired. So just being different and creative just for that doesn't get you where you want to go. But if you can think of something creative, and one of the amazing things to me is sometimes it takes so little to to make us stand out. A handwritten thank you note for the interview. Just some kind of expression of appreciation. You know, I wrote a blog about this a while back. When I was a kid, I was in high school, and I worked for the little local radio station.
Okay.
And the owner of the radio station was based in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, but the radio station was in southern Indiana. And there was a big change at the station, and I was let go because I was part-time and they were going to all full-time. So I was fired. And I was so upset. You know, I'd never been fired from a job before. I loved this job. I was really upset. And I said, I think I ought to call Mr. Vogel. He was the owner of the station in Tennessee.
Okay.
And my dad said, yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And I said, I'm going to tell him I didn't think I deserved to be fired. And my dad had some really wise words. He said, you know, Mr. Vogel has a significant investment. All the equipment, all of the, you know, the investment that he has made to have that radio station. And you're 16 years old, and a lot of times you were there alone. I think instead of calling him to complain, you ought to call him to thank him for the responsibility that he gave you.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I called him, and he took my call, and I could tell when he first came on the phone, you know, that he didn't know why I was calling. And I said, well, and he had been so nice to me when he visited the station. I said, I just wanted to say thank you for being so nice to me, and thank you for connecting with me, and thank you for allowing me to be there. I know what an investment you made. Thank you so much. And he said, well, I did not hear that you were no longer with us, but you've been a great employee, and feel free to use me as a reference in the future.
Oh, wow.
3 months later, there was a change in management at the station, and the new manager called me, and he said, Mr. Vogel said that the only condition for me to be the manager of the station is that I had to bring you back.
Yay!
Yay! You know, but it taught me so much about the approach that can create distinction in the marketplace. Because my initial thing was, I'm going to call and give him a piece of my mind, or what an idiot, you know, the typical reaction. But then when you back up and look at it from 30,000 feet, and here's the other thing, there were several other folks that were let go that same day, and no one else picked up the phone. No one else wrote him a letter to say thanks. No one else did anything else. So just making a phone call of gratitude, even when I got fired, taught me an invaluable lesson about the importance of distinction. A lot of times with speeches now, you know, it'll get down to two people, right? Well, we got it between one speaker and another. And even if they choose the other speaker, we send a thank you.
Of course,
because they took their time to consider me. And Angela, it's amazing how many responses we get that they've never had that from another speaker. And it's amazing how many times we book the engagement then the next year.
Wow.
Simply because of the connection.
That's amazing. It sounds so like common sense and just common courtesy that you would, do that. It sounds like your dad had some great advice.
He did. You know, like most 16-year-olds, I thought I knew everything, and my dad didn't know much. You know, the old joke is, you know, it's incredible how much smarter your parents get the older you are.
Absolutely.
But it's really, really important, and it's a way that we can establish that. Jim Rohn, who was Tony Robbins' mentor, right? He was the speaker that inspired Tony Robbins. Jim Rohn had this great line that the impact of it I missed. I didn't really get it at first, but he said, that which is easy to do is also easy not to do.
Yes.
Which is why most people won't do it.
Yes.
And his example is, to write a thank you note isn't rocket science, right? I mean, it's easy to do. But it's so easy to do that it's easy not to do.
Right.
So most people don't do it. So if we just do those things, those small, easy things, and do them creatively, we'll truly stand out in the market. The third of the four destroyers or the four cornerstones is communication. And what we found was that distinctive professionals and distinctive organizations communicated in narrative. They tended to tell more stories. they tended to use more examples. And so what happens is stories are word pictures.
Yes.
They help the listener visualize. And for some reason, the mind holds on to images in much greater detail than it holds on to words. For example, you never walk up to someone and say, I remember your name, but your face escapes me. Right? I mean,
Exactly.
We remember the picture. I remember the face. And I've done this, Angela. I've walked up to people, and I can't remember their name, but I can tell them exactly where we were the last time we talked and what the conversation was about. You told me this story about, but I don't remember their name. And it's amazing how the mind works that way. So if we're able to use illustrations, if we're able to use stories, it is a great way to connect, and it's a great way. I mean, geez, I just realized I just did it. I can tell you the importance of saying thank you and creating connections. But I just gave you a story about the radio station of my boss, which is a better way to do that rather than just say, here are the 4 things to do.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, so that's the key. Or the Taxi Terry story is a better way to get you to understand the importance of how you can create distinction in a commodity market.
Yes.
Than it is to just to say that it's important to do. So think of how you can use narrative. Think of how you can use stories as a way to communicate more effectively. And then the final of the 4 is a customer experience focus. In business, it means that we're focused not just on the customer, but we're focused on what does it feel like to do business with us? What are the sensations? What are the emotions? We found that the distinctive businesses had an obsession for sensation.
Yes.
Right? I mean, Starbucks had an obsession with what did it feel like when you came in, and how was it different from the other places where you'd get your morning coffee, and on. And it was just in the Apple Store yesterday, another example. So what is the experience that you're creating in a job interview, for example? And again, it gets back to something that we talked about earlier. It's focusing on them. I mean, how are we creating an experience for them? I think a lot of times we go in and we want them to create. It's exactly the story that you used, Angela. Of well, if you could find me a job where I, 8 to 5, and right. I mean, the focus was on my needs, not my employer's, right?
Yes.
And so that immediately makes us less attractive. But when we come in with a focus on their needs, it's amazing how much more frequently we'll get our own needs met.
Absolutely.
And so focusing on their experience, not your own, I think is critical in creating marketplace distinction.
Absolutely. So you're kind of leading into my next question, which is, as we're out and we're searching for a job, you kind of mentioned a couple of tips. I'd love to get your tips as a job seeker. What can we do as an individual job seeker to stand out from our competition as we're searching for a job?
Well, there's a lot of ways, and I think one of the things is to think about. It begins with attitude. It begins with perspective, and it's not just the typical have a positive mental attitude, smile. Don't get me wrong, that's critical. I want you to do that. But the second thing is what we were just talking about. How do you? Psychologists call it transpositional thinking. How do you put yourself in their shoes? And so, beginning by saying, I'm certain that what you're seeking in an employer or as an employer would be these things, right? And confirm with them that in fact is what they're seeking. But it's amazing to me. We recently filled a position with our little company, and it was amazing to me exactly what you said earlier. How many people came to us with what they wanted from the job, but little research or little recognition about what we might want from the employee.
Yes.
Right? And the person that got it was the person that came and said, okay, I've been to your website. I know that you do this. One of the things it seems that perhaps you could use some assistance with is this. Let me tell you a story about my qualifications and how I helped another organization that was looking for something similar.
Wow, that's perfect.
Right? And so, I mean, I'm hooked at this point. And so that transpositional thinking of, I've done my research, I've looked at your situation, it seems this might be of value. Wow, this is what I really bring to you, and the commitment that I have, right? I mean, as a small employer, that's what I'm looking for, and it's amazing how much I can help you fulfill what you're looking for when you have the attitude that the priority is to create distinction within the organization and help my organization create distinction in the marketplace.
Yes, I feel like you show that your goals are aligned to the organization. And
Absolutely.
essentially, you're selling your skills, when you go in for an interview and the company is deciding whether or not to buy those skills. It's not about how much vacation that you want and all the time that you want to have off in the evening. I mean, that's not what that moment in time is about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm selling my skills and I'm selling my fit. Right? I mean, I'm selling the skills that I have, but I'm also selling how I can fit in your corporate culture.
Yes.
Because I could have all the computer skills in the world, but if I wear a pinstripe suit with the white shirt and red tie into interview for a job at the Apple Store, they might kind of look at me like, you might not fit in. Your skills might be good, but you really might not fit into what we do here.
That's right.
And so what I want to do is to use those 4 cornerstones to show them how the skills I have are a great fit with what they're trying to attain and what they're trying to achieve in their organization.
I completely agree. Well, we have covered so many topics. These have all been so helpful. Is there any last bit of advice that you'd like to leave us with today?
Wow. I think we really covered the waterfront, but if I could reiterate, as a small employer myself, I really, and as someone that speaks to, I do about 100 speeches a year to different companies, and the line I keep hearing is, there's 2. Number 1, it's hard to find good people. Well, I don't think that's true to a degree. I think that good people aren't really good at letting you know they're good. Does that make sense?
I think it totally makes sense, yeah.
There are great people out there. But I think, unfortunately, and I think this is why the work you do, Angela, is so critical, I think a lot of times those great people aren't especially proficient at letting a prospective employer know how terrific they could be for that organization. The second thing that I hear constantly is the movement to hire for attitude and personality and then educate for skill. And so that means that if that's the direction, because I'm hearing that all the time, what we want are good people, and then we'll educate and train them for the skills for the job. What that means is that if you go in and you have skills, but you're also able to show them that you're a person with great personality and great commitment and great attitude, then you've already risen to the top of the list.
Absolutely.
If you can combine the two. So, show them that you're a great person. Show them that you have the right attitude. Show them that you have the right perspective. And I think it dramatically enhances the number of organizations that would love to do business with you.
You're absolutely right. Well, you have so much great advice. How can we learn more about you, and where can we get copies of your books?
Oh, thanks for asking. It's Scott McKain, and the last name's spelled a little different from the senator from Arizona. I'm McKain. So it's scottmckain.com, SCOTTMCKAIN.com. Has all the information about me. You can search under my name at Amazon, and all the books and all the information is there. In addition, we have a website called DistinctionInstitute.com. And if you go to DistinctionInstitute.com, there's information there on our educational programs of what it takes to create distinction in the marketplace.
Very good. And are you also on social media?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Just Scott McKain on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Just Scott McKain, all one word, hooks you up with me on all the social media platforms. And I'm very active on social media and love the dialogue with folks. So would appreciate any contact on social media. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much. This has been great.
Angela, it's been a thrill to be with you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.